Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2010 Deming Lecture. I'm Blanton Godfrey, and I have the privilege of chairing the Deming Lecture Committee and also the honor of introducing the 2010 Deming Lecturer. But before doing so, I would first like to thank the Deming Lecture Committee members, Bovis Abraham, Stephen Cohen, William Cumberland, Kenneth Kohler, Sunil Rao, Marilyn Seastrom, and Donna Stroop for a very lot of hard work this year, a very difficult job. And I'd also like to thank our Awards Council liaisons, Sally Morton and Nagambal Shah, and most of all, our staff liaison from the ASA office, Pam Graven, who did an amazing amount of work. We actually had an outstanding set of nominations this year, so the task of selecting the lecturer was a pleasant one, but a very difficult one. The Deming Lecture Award was established in 1995 to honor the accomplishments of W. Edwards Deming, to recognize the accomplishments of the awardee, and to enhance the awareness among the statistical community of the scope and importance of Deming's contributions. Notable among Deming's achievements are his contributions to sampling theory, the statistical contributions to business and industry, and his contributions to management. The criteria for the selection of the awardee are that the individual has made significant contribution in fields related to those in which Deming devoted his career. And also the lecture should be presented in the spirit of Deming's views about his statistical practice. And I quote, "I am to engage only in work that offers opportunity to create new statistical methods or to use existing methods to help other scientists and professionals to improve their research or to acquire new knowledge through planned research about materials and mankind, or to improve efficiency, uniformity, quality service, and performance of product, or to achieve smoother operation and more effective administration and management of industry and government." Covers a broad front. Deming himself received first an electrical engineering degree from the University of Wyoming, then an MS from the University of Colorado, and a PhD from Yale in mathematics and mathematical physics. Although trained as an engineer and physicist, he always thought of himself as a statistician. His letterhead on his stationery always just said, "Statistical Consultant." While working with the U.S. Department of Agriculture as a mathematical physicist, he edited a series of lectures delivered by Walter Schuhart into a book called Statistical Method from the Viewpoint of Quality Control. By the way, Schuhart himself was a founding member and president of the Institute of Mathematical Statistics and also president of the American Statistical Association. And while at the USDA, Deming also served as a statistical advisor from the United States Census Bureau. During World War II, he taught statistical process control techniques to workers engaged in wartime production. It's estimated that his team collectively taught over 10,000 workers during the war. After the war, he was invited by MacArthur to plan a census for the Japanese population. While there working on the census, he was invited by the Union of Japanese Scientists and Engineers to give a series of lectures on quality control, a subject they had been studying from the papers of Walter Schuhart. Later, when quality became a critical competitive concern for American companies, Deming was rediscovered in the U.S., and it is estimated that over 100,000 people attended his 4-day seminars, first stressing statistical methods and later addressing the more difficult question of management, how to actually get the methods used and the most critical problems facing the companies solved. Our Deming lecturer today is a perfect selection that illustrates a remarkably parallel career inspired by Dr. Deming. Dr. Brent James has a BS in electrical engineering and computer science and medical biology, and an MD, and of course, most importantly, an MS in statistics. He's the Chief Quality Officer and Executive Director for the Institute of Healthcare Delivery Research at Intermountain Healthcare in Salt Lake City. Intermountain is an integrated system of 25 hospitals, almost 140 clinics, covering more than 500,000 lives in Utah, Idaho, and at a tertiary level, 7 surrounding states. Brent is known internationally for his work in clinical quality improvement, patient safety, and the infrastructure that underlies successful improvement efforts such as cultural change, data systems, payment methods, and management roles. He is an elected member of the National Academy of Science Institute of Medicine. He's a fellow of the American College of Physician Executives, and he holds faculty appointments at the University of Utah School of Medicine, the Harvard School of Public Health, and the University of Sydney School of Public Health. Through the Intermountain Advanced Training Program in clinical practice, Brent has trained more than 3,500 senior physician, nursing, and administrative executives drawn from around the world in clinical management methods. They also have worked in 8 different countries with 40 daughter training programs with proven improvement results. He has been honored with many awards for quality in healthcare delivery, including the C. Jackson Grayson Medal, Distinguished Quality Pioneer from the American Quality and Productivity Center this year, the American College of Medical Quality Founders Award in 1999, and the CIBA Geneva Outcomes Leadership Award in 1996. For each of the past 5 years, he has been named among the 50 most powerful physician executives in healthcare by Modern Physician, and the 100 most powerful people in healthcare by Modern Healthcare. I got to know Brent almost 20 years ago when Don Berwick, the recently appointed director of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, put together a Harvard summer 5-week course on clinical quality, and the late Harry Roberts of the University of Chicago Statistics Department. Brent and I co-taught this course with Don for 4 summers. I had the easy part, just teach basic quality control and improvement. Brent had the hard part, translate these methods and how they could improve healthcare. Brent recently was elected to the board of directors of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, where I have the honor of working with Brent once again. And many of you might remember the cover story article by David Lenhart in the 2003 and the November 3rd, 2009 Sunday New York Times Magazine. The title, and Brent was a cover boy on the magazine, the title was "Dr. James Will Make You Better." In this article, Lenhart describes how Brent uses statistical analyses to make dramatic improvements in the care of patients and significant reductions in mortality. We really look forward to your presentation, Brent.
I really just have to say a special thank you to Dr. Godfrey and, more important, to the Deming Lecture Committee. Even more important, Dr. Marlene Egger, a member of my department back at the University of Utah, the real champion for biostatistical training in Utah. She keeps nominating me for fun things like this, and without her, I wouldn't be here, frankly. The mainstay, again, of our department. I want to tell you a story. It's going to be a story mostly about medicine. It has 4 parts, though, to it. The first part, I need to shape a framework about why this is critical today, absolutely critical. I then need to tell 2 parallel stories, one in medicine, one in manufacturing, and then bring them together. In a very real sense, it is the story of Sir William Osler. Osler was the father of internal medicine. As I'll demonstrate in just a moment, he marked an era. But there was another era that awaited medicine that came through W. Edwards Deming, a story of which I was a part. Just to start out then, with the first part of that, last summer I had the opportunity to participate fairly heavily in Washington, D.C. in healthcare reform. Testified before the Senate Finance Committee twice, the Senate Help Committee, Ted Kennedy's committee, the House Ways and Means Committee, but more than that, spent many, many hours working with the staffs of those committees about how we could transform 1/6 of the United States economy. The core issue came down to 2 things. The first was 46 million estimated people without insurance in the United States. The second was cost increases that are bankrupting the country. Now, this was not a new idea. In fact, that line could have been from Dr. Deming when he named healthcare as one of the diseases of modern industry. I tried to champion the idea that we should do cost control first, and frankly, I lost. My colleagues argued that extending insurance was the first thing we needed to do. Most of you probably haven't seen a breakout of the actual sources of the uninsured. This is just to give you a sense of it. About 21%, 9.5 million of those people are technically illegal workers. It's the immigration problem. About 12 million, the single largest contingent, about 26% of the total, are eligible for current federal programs but choose not to enroll. The problem is bureaucratic barriers. They qualify, but the process of actually enrolling is difficult, onerous. In fact, the people who would be best able to benefit from the programs are least able to sign up. In most healthcare systems, we have specialists to help them do that. This was put in place to control potential fraud and abuse within the programs and to control budgets. Third largest group, 9 million people roughly, are the temporarily uninsured. These are people who are usually transitioning jobs out of insurance for an average of about 6 months, but then are able to re-enter the insurance market. Free riders, about 7 million. These are people with a personal income of greater than $84,000 per year. They could afford health insurance, but choose not to participate. They tend to be the indestructible young who just don't see a good return on investment from buying health insurance. It's too much expense compared to what they get. Probably when you thought intuitively about the uninsured, it's that last line. About 8 million people, about 17% of the total, who are forced out of the insurance market by pre-existing conditions, what we call underwriting. They benefited the most from the recently passed federal law. And frankly, I believe that it's long past due that we help these Americans. The idea of a country like the United States not providing that level of social support is unconscionable at some level. The temporarily uninsured will also benefit. Here's the thing, though. A quote from a famous economist, health economist at Stanford University, Alan Enthoven, made this statement a few days after the new law passed. The United States does not have decades to wait for health system reform. In 2009, about $1.15 trillion of the federal budget was spent on health care. Health care expenditures are growing 2.7% per year faster than non-health care gross domestic product. The rate of inflation in health care is substantially higher, roughly twice domestic consumer price index inflation or growth of the economy. The main statement, though, the current reform bill does practically nothing to slow health expenditures. Just to give you a feel for that, this shows for 2005 and 2009 the federal deficit. The aqua bar down here at the bottom is the official debt, just under $8 trillion. You need to add on, though, the federal government's obligations to military and civilian retirees in terms of health care and pension funds. When you total the full amount, their current debt is about $14 trillion. This year, the federal government will spend $209 billion in interest service on that debt. Well, one of the reasons they've been able to spend so highly is because of the very, very low interest rates that they experience at the present time, less than 1%. If the economy picks up speed, almost certainly they're going to have to compete for money against other potential borrowers. A reasonable lower bound for the rate that they'll pay on that money is about 5.5%. At that rate, debt service, interest on the current federal debt will be over $1 trillion a year, just in terms of debt service. Well, an interesting way of looking at the data, this is just the tip of the iceberg. It goes down to that orange line, what we've seen so far. You see, the federal government has made a number of commitments to American citizens beyond current levels of funding. So this shows the shortfall, the additional contribution to deficit spending, calculated as net present value. The reason that Social Security is not viable long term, it falls about $7.7 trillion short based upon current funding. The 13% of all wages and salaries that goes into the Social Security system, 6.5% on your pay stub, 6.5% matching contribution from your employer, still falls well short. That's roughly the same size, though, of just the new Medicare Part D drug benefit. That new entitlement that we created a few years ago has about a $7.2 trillion shortfall beyond current levels of funding. Well, that's relatively small compared to Medicare Part A. That's the hospital trust fund for hospital care under Medicare. $13.8 trillion shortfall. Medicare Part B is the largest. That's payments to physicians. About $17.2 trillion shortfall. When you total it all up, it's about a $60 trillion debt exposure for the United States government. Just to put that in perspective, the net present value of the United States of America, all of our public and private, intellectual and physical property, about $45 trillion. So this represents a substantial amount beyond the current value of the United States of America. Did you notice that 2/3 of it is Medicare? When President Obama says that the key to the United States economy and frankly the future of the country is health care, he is technically correct. Now, given that we're meeting and speaking in Canada, I should extend this. In the last 2 years, I've had teams from about 15 different foreign countries through my office. Australia several times, several Canadian contingents, Singapore, several from Sweden, a couple from Great Britain, Germany, Netherlands, you get the picture. Every one of them sees themselves as in financial straits, financial meltdown, because of health care. We're about middle of the pack in terms of the rate of increase in health care costs. Yeah, a little bit more perspective. This is from last year's report of the Medicare Board of Trustees. The long-range financial imbalance could be addressed in several different ways. These changes would require an immediate 134% increase in the tax rate or an immediate 53% reduction in expenditures for the Medicare program to bring us into financial stability for the future. The recent law that just passed, the PPACA, the reform bill with its combination of additional taxes and reduced payments, is preliminarily estimated to accomplish about 1/4 of that change. Oh, that assumes that the savings contained in the bill are real. The problem is that none of us believe that they're real who work in the field. Just to illustrate, about $500 billion in savings over the next 10 years from reduced payments to care providers, hospitals, and physicians. Literally the day after the bill passed, Nancy Pelosi in the U.S. House of Representatives proposed emergency legislation to rescind something called the sustainable growth rate. That's a law that an earlier Congress passed over 10 years ago to control the rate of increase of physician spending, payments to physicians within Medicare. Every year, the then extant Congress has delayed the cuts, and they've accumulated over time. If allowed to go into place, it would have been 21.3% reduction in payments to physicians for Medicare as of last April. The reason that Speaker Pelosi was asking for emergency spending is she doesn't have to find money to fund it. It just drops onto the deficit, the federal deficit. Members of her own party, though, would not allow her to do that. We kicked the can down the road till November of this year when it would require a 30% cut. Oh, the point. That was $255 billion of the savings contained in the $500 billion total savings associated with payment reductions in this bill. American Hospital Association estimates that if we cut hospital payments in the way that they're proposing, that about 15% of all hospitals in the United States will fail. Well, yes, it means that Medicare-aged patients will have full insurance. They just won't have a physician or hospital in that kind of a circumstance. I hope I'm painting an appropriately gloomy picture of the finances. We're in for a rough ride. If you think the health reform debate was interesting, just wait. In working with some of the members of those committees, when you got them after a hard day's work, a couple of glasses of wine in them over dinner, off the record, they would freely admit that they were creating a true financial crisis for the United States. Just to illustrate, I sit on a board of advisors for the Healthcare Financial Management Association. I'm there as a clinician. Dr. Glenn Steele, the head of Geisinger Clinics, there as a clinician. The rest of the members are big money guys. Senior vice presidents for KPMG, for example, they tell me 5 years. before the increased spending in PPACA and the other forces driving up healthcare expenditures will create a financial crisis of a size that will threaten the long-term viability of the United States, is the way that they describe it. Interestingly, at over-dinner conversation, as we talked about creating a financial crisis, the political argument was that was the only circumstance in which the United States would step up and solve the problem. I want to talk to you today about solving the problem. When I talk about Dr. Deming consulting for Sir William Osler, the father of quality improvement, consulting for the father of medicine, we're talking about solving that problem. I'm actually fairly sanguine. I think it's going to work. I think we can do it. But that's where the solution lies, you see. So 2 stories. Story number 1. Turns out that as long as there have been human beings, the healing arts have been central to human society. The earliest written records we have of humankind, the Code of Hammurabi, talks about clinical practice. It goes deeper than that. We find artifacts from Stone Age, pre-literate societies that indicate that the healing role was central to those societies too. Across millennia, though, at least 6,000 or 7,000 years where we have some sort of record, the healing arts were inherently limited in what they could accomplish. It came down to 2 things. Someone would come to us with a problem, a health problem. Well, we'd seen it before. We could explain the present. More important, we knew where it led next. We could predict the future. But that was pretty much the limits of what we had to offer. We had no effective cures. Just to illustrate, as late as 1900 in the United States of America, the most common therapy that was offered for almost any clinical problem was still bloodletting, bleeding. In fact, we'd moved to the kinder, gentler form of bloodletting rather than slashing veins and draining them into a bowl. Well, physicians were often called leeches because we use leeches so frequently, a different reason than for which we're called leeches today, you see. It was based upon something called a humoral theory of disease that arose with the ancient Greeks, or at least they were the first who wrote about it. The idea that the human body was made up of 4 basic humors, usually identified by color. Disease was caused by an imbalance in the humors. Health was restored by bringing a patient back into balance, usually by getting rid of some of the red humor. That was the most common therapy in 1900 in the United States for any condition. On number 2, purgatives, chemically induced vomiting and diarrhea. We didn't just drop your hematocrit, we dehydrated you at the same time. Now, nobody measured it very carefully, but those who wrote about it, the educated class, fairly routinely opined in their writings that if you were seriously ill and you sought the attentions of a typical physician, the chances of survival went down. And they were almost certainly correct. Not that there weren't some points of light in the mix, usually at universities scattered here and there. I'm talking about the common form of medicine on a very broad scale in the United States and Europe. Well, the point behind all of this, right around 1910, that all changed. It actually tracks back to people like Florence Nightingale, a British nurse during the Crimean War. Her studies of the epidemiology of infectious disease in a body of fighting men are still classics today. Oh, but she was a consultant to the United States government during the American Civil War. And that's where you really first start to see it, during the Civil War, with Nightingale's idea. My favorite model for the change, Sir William Osler, a Canadian physician practicing at Johns Hopkins University Hospital when it was first founded in 1895, and really the marker of an age. He was the embodiment, the epitome of a new age of medicine. Oh, the same medicine that I learned 100 years later when I went to medical school. The same medicine that almost all physicians and nurses practice today. So I hold Sir William Osler up as a face for modern medicine, you see. The role that he's often seen to hold within the medical profession. They did 4 main things across those 2 generations, really, of our professional progenitors. Starting in 1902 with the report of the American Medical Association. That led in 1908 to Andrew Carnegie hiring a high school teacher named Abner Flexner. As a direct result of the Flexner report, evaluating clinical education, more than half of all purported medical schools in the United States shut down. well, medical schools. The average course of study was about 4 months to become a licensed physician. It was done completely in a classroom setting, no exposure to patients at all. The way I think about it is, how much training does it take to learn the humoral theory of disease, bloodletting, and purgatives? And the short answer is not much. We got the model for medical education and nursing education that we still use today in its original form at the patient's bedside in a hospital with hands-on experience, 2-year course of study. Now this puts some real teeth into licensing, professional licensing. The laws existed primarily to protect the Guild of Medicine from external competition. But with the new educational standard, they suddenly took on a whole new meaning. You had to have demonstrated skills, knowledge, and abilities to practice medicine or nursing. The third one is perhaps the most important. At this point, the allopathic healing professions, led by medicine under the direct leadership of people like Sir William Osler, formally adopted the scientific method as a basis for how we know what we know. It's our first real example of evidence-based medicine, that commitment. And as we'll see, it bore wonderful fruit since. Yeah, as part of that, they abandoned the humoral theory of disease and adopted something called the germ theory of disease, the idea of microorganisms, or is extended today to something like genetics, you see. And finally, 1895, Johns Hopkins University Hospital, a new organizational structure for hospitals. They separated management of the facility from clinical practice and created a group of professional managers to run the building itself, the staffing, the supplies, freeing the physicians to concentrate solely and exclusively on patient needs. A distinction that we need to revisit in just a few minutes. Now, when they did this, they put the healing professions on a fundamentally new trajectory. I found this great quote. It's from a fellow named Henderson, professor of medicine at Harvard at the time. He dated 1912, the Great Divide. For the first time in human history, he said, a random patient with a random disease, consulting a doctor chosen at random, stands a better than 50-50 chance of benefiting from the encounter. He got the sense of it just right. Every time I see this little quote, 1912, it seems so precise for this major social transformation. He was there, I wasn't. But what I can show you is that it really did change the nature of the healing arts. The best way I know to show that is life expectancy at birth. Shown in this graph, a child born in 1900 in the United States had life expectancy of 49 years. A child born 100 years later, in 2000, 77 years. That's a gain of 28 years in life expectancy against a base of 49 years. We fundamentally redefined what it meant to be a human being through this transition. And it's attributable to the scientific method and the healing arts. Well, the orange part of the line back here to the left, we sometimes call the public health era. Almost all of that gain is associated with control of epidemic infectious disease through immunization and sanitation. So those cholera epidemics that would literally kill 5,000 people in a community, 8,000 people in a community at one time. Well, the big one in London in 1875 killed over 25,000 people in a single epidemic. You see, it was a shift in thinking. We stopped thinking under the humoral theory of disease of cholera as a miasma, literally, in some cases, a mist in the night. Close your windows when you go to bed. To understanding that it was a waterborne bacterium associated with dumping raw sewage in the Thames River above where culinary water supplies were extracted. You see, disappeared. Oh, a better example. In 1900, somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 3 children died before reaching the age of 5 years here in the United States. Every home had a few small graves behind it. Diphtheria, pertussis or whooping cough, mumps, measles, polio. Unheard of today through immunization, you see. During that time period, life expectancy increased by about 3.5 years with each passing decade. An amazing accomplishment. Now, right around 1960, you see another new phenomenon. Two things actually happen in parallel. The first is that public health gains attenuate. If we had the right group in the room, we could have a big debate around that. It's very clear compared to other countries, Canada, European nations, the United States does not do as well on public health. That's the main difference for performance differences between the United States and those nations. just in passing. It's not the healthcare delivery system, it's public health functions, by and large. Yeah, we'd have that debate, but my counterpoint would be functionally we're stable. It's ephemeral. You have to maintain it. Of course, one of the great dangers of war or natural disaster is that the infrastructure for public health disappears. Very often the health toll from resurgence of those communicable diseases far outweighs the direct physical impact of the disaster. Yeah, the thing that came into play starting in about 1960 was 60 years of science that had massively improved our understanding of the human organism in health and disease and given us literally thousands of ways that we could intervene to change a patient's future. For the first time in human history, we had effective treatment. Changed the model from explain the present and predict the future to explain, predict, and change a patient's future, you see. The interesting thing is before about 1960, you cannot show a population-level health benefit from hospitals and clinics. We had no effective therapy that worked on a broad scale for the main takers of human life. But that changed. Admittedly, the rate of increase is attenuated a bit. It's only about 1 3/4 years gain in life expectancy with each passing decade. But it's still a phenomenal success story. The way I like to say it, we routinely achieve miracles in care delivery. Let's put it this way on the evidence. Any person suffering a major health challenge today who fails to seek the time and attention of a qualified health professional is an idiot on the data because of our demonstrated successes. Just to illustrate, the #1 killer in any modern industrialized nation today is ischemic heart disease. Since 1960, the age-adjusted mortality from that condition has declined by more than 56%. From about 307 deaths per 100,000 per year to only about 135 deaths per 100,000 per year. Phenomenal success story. Statins to control blood cholesterol, prevent the disease. You see? Better treatment of heart attacks when they do occur, a whole series of things associated with it. #2 killer is cancer. I couldn't figure out how to get it on my slide. It's really a series of different diseases. Not quite as profound an impact, but still very, very impressive. And just to illustrate, those pediatric leukemias that when I was in medical school were fairly uniformly fatal within a few months, today considered almost completely curable with that ongoing advance of science, medical science. #3 killer, stroke. Since 1950, a 70% decline in stroke-related mortality and morbidity. You see the picture? It's a wonderful story. Now, in truth, the other little bit that you ought to know is that all of those accomplishments account for about 5% of a human being's total health. About 40% of your health comes from your own behaviors, about 30% from genetics, about 20% from public health. Well, it's about 3.5 years of life expectancy for every American today, attributable to care delivery within the system. And at my age, 3.5 years looks pretty good. We don't want to be too cavalier about that. But I did want to make the point that we routinely achieve miracles. And it's attributable to Osler and his colleagues and the vision that they had for a new world. Well, now, fast forward 100 years. Jack Lindbergh published his seminal article in 1973, really, in the journal Science. He had been looking at care delivery and discovered a very interesting phenomenon. It appeared that care varied on a geographic basis. He was looking at medical communities, not all in the same system, but people that routinely worked together, referred to each other. He had identified geographic communities of this nature across the United States. He very carefully adjusted for underlying patient factors so that he was getting a fair population look, and found more than 5-fold variation in the rates at which patients were hospitalized for common conditions. It's interesting. It turns out that where you live in the United States today is more important than whether you have insurance in determining the care you will actually receive for common significant diseases. You see? This is what we call deeply professionally troubling, this massive variation in care delivery. The way Jack says it, geography is destiny. Rich Dale at the University of Washington had an even better way of saying it. Who you see is what you get. You see? This marked my own entry into the field. It was some years later, 1986, I first went to Intermountain from the Harvard School of Public Health. We started some studies to carry this one step further. Wenberg and many others had looked at hospitalization rates. Well, we were a hospital system. We wanted to say, is the care the same once someone's hospitalized for a particular condition? In a 2-year time period, we studied 6 major conditions. Basic study design would find every condition treated within our system. I mean, for that specific diagnosis, that specific disease. We would very carefully balance the patients. We tried to identify and stage every comorbid illness on presentation, identify and stage every complication, track long-term outcomes of care to make sure that we were getting a fair comparison. And then we compared to see if care was delivered in a consistent way. I'm going to show you the physician cut. You need to know that it didn't matter how we cut the data. We found massive variation. Just to give you a feel for it, this was the first thing we studied, a surgical procedure called transurethral prostatectomy. 16 urologic surgeons with a statistically meaningful number of cases, carefully balanced cases that so far as we could tell were statistically identical coming in and going out. So it was fair to look at the process that happened in the middle. These are 2 factors that the surgeons themselves had identified as critical when doing a TURP. The little green boxes show true surgical cut time. Generally, as surgeons, we like to hold our times lower. There's less risk to the patient. The little red circles show grams of prostatic tissue removed. That's the whole point of the operation, is to remove prostate. I've arrayed these 16 surgeons in order of grams per minute. So here at the left, I have physician M, who took 40 minutes on median to remove 40 grams of tissue per patient. At the far right, I have physician F, who took 90 minutes to remove 17 grams of tissue per patient. Just to give you a feel for variation in the sample, 90 minutes of surgery down to 38 is just a little bit more than a 2.5 times difference, 250% multiplicative or 150% additive difference. From 13 grams of tissue per patient to 42, it's just a little bit more than a 3-fold difference. The closest we ever found physicians to come across about 90 factors associated with the TURP was about a 60% additive difference. The widest was about a 560% additive difference, just in passing. Huge variation. It's interesting too, very counterintuitive. The graph kind of shows a very strong statistical result. The longer you operate, the less tissue you remove, which is not what we expected. The reason for examining the data this way, our chief of surgery at LDS Hospital, our flagship, had pointed us to an article in the literature that associated grams per minute with the major complication associated with TURP. It was reobstruction within 1 year requiring reoperation. It concentrated in these 3 surgeons and had a massively strong association with grams per minute. We validated that finding in our own data. It had a direct impact on patient care quality. In other words, if you see what I mean. Well, this was really the start for me. I guess my personal story of Dr. Deming, I'd shown this particular study at a national meeting in Chicago, Quality Measurement and Management Project. We had a new member of the invitational group, a fellow named Paul Batalden, pediatrician from Minneapolis. He was the vice president for quality at HCA back before they became part of Columbia. I'd shown right before lunch, and over lunch was talking about it with Paul. He said, you know, your study reminds me of variation analysis done in manufacturing. He knew a statistician who understood this kind of variation analysis. He said, promised to send me some articles. I got home, and the next week I got an envelope in the mail from Nashville, Tennessee from Paul. In it were 2 articles from a fellow named W. Edwards Deming. And when I read Dr. Deming's articles, I realized that he had a theory that was describing our research findings. It was just intriguing. I called Paul back up and said, tell me more. I ended up attending Dr. Deming's course at the Hotel del Coronado in December of 1987 and met the man, had a chance to talk with him. He had many more ideas, as you'll see, that were very, very useful. Turns out that this set of studies, though, is just the first marker. If you listen carefully in the health reform debates, there was a litany of complaints against the healthcare delivery system. Every time you picked up the paper, anytime a politician was on the stump, they categorized into 5 main areas. I was already familiar with the areas. You see, we have a massive body of research in the health services research literature about how healthcare today falls short of its theoretic potential. Now, there's something you need to know about this. Nearly all of this work was done in the United States. We tend to fund research much more heavily. We have a less robust body of evidence that comes from Canada, Great Britain, Sweden, Europe, Canada, Australia, and the rest of the free world. The results across those countries, though, are essentially identical. There are small differences, but in tone and tenor, general direction, essentially identical. You will not find a solution for this by traveling the world. It does not appear to bear a strong association to health policy at a national level. Could I just run the list, though, very quickly? It turns out they're all forms of variation. The key problem was variation, understanding it, responding appropriately to it. We've already talked about the first, massive variation in practices on a geographic basis. It turns out it doesn't matter if you just break out major academic medical centers. Same range of variation. This is not a town versus gown problem. Take the 100 best hospitals in the United States of America as identified by U.S. News and World Report. Same range of variation. It goes deep, it goes broad. In everything that we see, it's not just physicians, it's nurses, it's pharmacists, it's therapists, it's technicians. Any way you look at it. Second major body of work. If I use Jack Lindbergh as my poster child for the first, this would be Bob Brook at Rand, Chief Medical Officer at that institution, Senior Professor of Internal Medicine at UCLA. This body of researchers said perhaps we can explain the variation in rates by inappropriate care. Now, their definition of inappropriate was purely medical, no consideration of cost at all. Care was judged to be inappropriate if the risk of the treatment to the patient outweighed any potential benefit. You have to remember that any treatment we use today in medicine has the potential to harm. Any treatment powerful enough to heal can also harm, as we well understand. Well, it's just a risk-benefit purely from a patient's perspective. They constructed careful studies to evaluate that. Proved 2 things. The first is that inappropriate care does not explain the geographic variation. On average, high utilization geographies have about the same amount of care judged to be clinically inappropriate as do low utilization locations. The second finding was much more troubling. For some major treatments routinely used in hospitals, as much as 32% of all cases treated judged on careful review by one's peers to be clinically inappropriate. Where the risk to the patient outweighed any potential benefit, it should never have been undertaken. But we did anyway, for some reason. You see, the truth about this one, it ranges from 2 to 32%. No one's done a careful synthetic study across the entire face of medicine. Rough guess, and this is only a guess, 15 to 20% of care delivery in the United States today is clinically inappropriate. Now, if you think number 1 was professionally challenging, number 2 was far more profound. I mean, this among professions that hold as our primary maxim, first do no harm. The idea that for some major treatments, 1/3 of all cases were actively placed in harm's way with no benefit that could outweigh that harm. Number 3, November 30th, 1999, the Institute of Medicine's Committee on Quality of Healthcare in America publishes a report called To Err is Human. Within that report, we estimated that somewhere between about 44,000 and 98,000 Americans die each year where the cause of death was the treatment they received in a hospital, not their underlying disease, and that it was preventable. Truth in Advertising, I was a member of that committee. My name's on the report. We'd done a careful evidence review. We'd found about 60 major studies. Believe it or not, we were trying to be conservative. And frankly, we were. A decade of research has demonstrated that that was a lower bound estimate of preventable harm in hospitals. Just to get it in perspective, that means more deaths from preventable injuries in hospitals than from the entire AIDS epidemic AIDS at its peak was only about 16,000 deaths per year. It's since attenuated. More deaths from hospitals than from breast cancer. Only about 35,000 deaths per year in the United States from breast cancer. More deaths from hospitals than from motor vehicle accidents, about 42,000 deaths per year from motor vehicle accidents. It means that hospitals are somewhere between the 4th and 6th most common cause of preventable death in the United States of America. And this one kind of has karmic balance. You have to love this one. The idea of a hospital is a major public health problem, because technically we are. Item number 4, we identified a second class of failure that we called injuries of omission. You see, number 3 were injuries of commission, where the harm actively harmed. An injury of omission means that I had hard evidence of benefit, strong randomized controlled trials showing survival benefit for patients. They tend to be non-controversial, generally accepted. The question was, how often do we do them correctly? Seminal studies in that class come from Beth McGlynn at Rand. She showed that in 90 such factors, validated quality measures, the Rand quality measures, that the current healthcare delivery system manages to do it correctly about 55% of the time for adults, 46% of the time for children. Now, of course, that's much better than 0. If we didn't have a healthcare delivery system, the number would be 0. That's the appropriate comparative statistic. But you have to ask the question, if we can achieve miracles of the sort that I showed you a few minutes ago, doing it correctly 55% of the time, what kind of miracles could we achieve if we could do it, well, 98% of the time, let's say, or 99? It means that we fall far short again of our theoretic potential. The final one you need to know, if I apply a Deming-style quality model, which enables me to identify waste in a process. Well, we had a grant from AHRQ a few years ago at Intermountain. We did exactly that. We built a robust model. Frankly, we weren't able to evaluate most of the components in our model. We had 6 major components. We could only evaluate 2. On the basis of those 2, we estimated over 50% of all current spending on healthcare delivery in the United States of America is technically waste, non-value adding from a patient's perspective. Oh, the other 4 categories were not trivial. Several of them are probably of the same scale of the 2 that we were able to evaluate. That's over 50% of a $2.5 trillion per year budget. Just to reiterate, when President Obama says that healthcare is the key to the United States economy, he is exactly technically correct. In terms of its impact on our deficits, in terms of its potential for a better future economically for the country. You see, there's a problem with this, of course. I want you to remember that one person's waste is another person's income is a major political contribution, which is functionally what's happening in our country today. Well, that's storyline number 1. Can I come back and draw storyline number 2 just as quickly? This story, I'm sorry, I'm ahead of myself. I wanted to talk about variation. I should stop though and first say we know why this occurred. We know why healthcare falls short of its theoretic potential. It's a head-on collision of 2 factors. The first is something called reliance on craft of medicine style practice. What it came up against was 100 years of science. We call that clinical uncertainty in the context of payment that encourages utilization. Craft of medicine, this is the philosophy of clinical practice that Sir William Osler and his colleagues gave us, that I learned in medical school, that we still teach today. It's based upon an ethical commitment to patients. That is our foundation, that we commit that we will place the patient's health care benefit before any other end or goal. The second major contributor is a massive body of knowledge, gained through formal education experience. I mean, for a physician, it's 4 years of medical school. It's typically 3 to 7 years of residency training, very often 1 or 2 two-year fellowships on top of that. Most of us would agree that you don't really master the knowledge base until you've been in practice for 5 or 10 years. You're looking at a minimum of about a 15-year commitment of your life to gain the knowledge base. Well, that's what we apply when a patient comes to us, you see. The idea then is standalone experts, individual experts. We can start largely with raw materials, and for each patient who comes to us, we can create a unique, personalized, carefully crafted diagnostic and therapeutic regimen just for that individual. And the promise we make is that that approach guarantees the best possible medical result for each individual. It's a model of personal excellence. It's a model that, as a trained physician, I kind of intuitively know the right thing to do based upon that deep experience, you see? And it worked. Remember the results that it produced for the nation across 100 years. What happened to it, though, was 100 years of science. In 1993, a colleague and I did a convenient sample of the variation literature, about 100 major articles I happen to have in my office, the big famous ones. We dug through the discussion sections looking for the hypotheses that those investigators had generated to explain the variation in practice that their studies had demonstrated. We found more than 70 identifiably different potential sources of variation. These were the top 4 in terms of force and frequency of citation. I take some credit. We did it empirically. David Eddy, the inventor of evidence-based medicine, had come to the same list just based on his experience. Mark Chasson, a major contributor to this literature, now the head of the Joint Commission, came to the same list from experience. I just wanted to quickly run them for you. It gives you an idea of the scope of the problem that we face in medicine. I hope you also appreciate how amazingly difficult it is to practice medicine in an effective way. Number 1 on the list. Imagine that a patient comes to me with a common clinical problem. It turns out I nearly always have a range of treatment options. It averages about 4 or 5. It can go as high as 80. For some, it's only 1, but quite rare to have it only be 1. The key question for evidence-based medicine is, how often do I have evidence for best therapy for you as a particular individual? What's the best choice for you? How often do I have evidence to direct my choice? You see? At the core of the variation question. Now, as evidence, I, of course, would prefer to have level 1 evidence, randomized controlled trial data from a good, well-designed randomized trial. I'm actually willing to accept, though, strong observational designs, quasi-experiments, case control studies, even case series. Well, at the extreme, within medicine, we accept level 3 evidence. That's expert consensus opinion from a group of respected authorities using formal methods in a published form. Even at that level, I can find evidence of best practice, on average, only about 5 to 10% of the time. 80 or 90% of the time, there is no evidence. 80 or 90% of the time, physicians and nurses can hold legitimate differences of opinion about what is best because there's no data, and they do. And it produces massive variation on a broad scale. The Institute of Medicine just finished a roundtable on evidence-based medicine that verified these results and really named this problem as a major challenge moving ahead with care delivery in the free world. Number 2 has to do with the rate of increase of new medical knowledge. We don't have a good empiric evaluation. The best current guess is that medical knowledge is doubling about every 5 to 8 years. Oh, what that means is that new internist coming into practice, she will have to learn, then unlearn, and relearn half of her medical knowledge base 6 times at a minimum over the course of her practice, assuming that it doesn't accelerate further. How do you do that when your days are full of patient care? The person who best evaluated this in the published literature is a fellow named Shanifelt. He found that 3 to 4 years after initial board certification, both generalist and specialist internists, cardiologists, rheumatologists, endocrinologists, began to show, quote, significant declines in general medical knowledge. It's not that they forgot things, they just couldn't keep up. He found that 14 to 15 years after initial board certification, 2/3 of internists couldn't pass the qualifying exam. Even better work came from John Williamson at Hopkins. Williamson demonstrated that for a major new research finding to make it into widespread practice across the United States takes about 17 to 20 years. The short answer, you had to wait for a generation of physicians to die in the harness and be replaced by a new group coming out of practice. What happened in the meantime was differential uptake. An individual in a particular community would discover this finding and champion it in their local community. And you'd see it suddenly blossom in that community. It's just that that uptake mechanism appeared to be completely random. So to see widespread geographic uptake, you had to replace a generation, you see. Number 3, we call it reliance on subjective recall. We have 3 lines of evidence associated with it. The first has to do with how the expert human mind works. Short version, we're pattern matchers. It's innately anecdotal. A good expert physician will subcompartmentalize a problem, then usually subjectively, subconsciously pattern match within a category. Now, when we're in that class of problems, of pattern matching problems, it works wonderfully well. Magic happens. We don't know how to replicate it analytically. It appears that the subconscious human mind is solving 7 or 8 or 9 simultaneous nonlinear equations. The most that we can solve analytically tends to run about 3 or 4 with a supercomputer, you see. So some magic happens when we're in that class of problems, for example, around diagnosis. The problem is with 100 years of science, the nature of the problems changed. It's a different class of problems. When you come to me and I say you have 5 treatment alternatives, it's not going to be pattern matching, it's going to be rate estimation. Here's your chance of a good outcome with this treatment. Here's your chance of a good outcome with this one, with this one, with this one, with this one. See that difference in rate estimation? Oh, the other 2 lines of evidence show how abysmally poorly the expert mind does when subjectively estimating rates. Lomas's work in Canada, for example, demonstrates that we'll misestimate measurable rates by 20 to 50%. We'll be off by as much as a factor of 2. Eddie's work shows that you can find physicians around a particular rate, critical rates that determine treatment. They range from 0 to 100% usually across a group of respected authorities with no pattern of response. You can find a physician who believes anything and is willing to testify to it in court based upon subjective recall. The key factor is called anchoring. We tend to be dominated by 1 or 2 recent cases in our recent memory, or if we had a particularly spectacular case in our distant past, good or bad, that becomes our lifetime experience. We call this problem the problem of subjective recall. Number 4 on the list. For us, it happened first in 1991 at LDS Hospital. We were running a big NIH-sponsored randomized controlled trial. It was around a disease called acute respiratory distress syndrome. Control arm was managing with ventilators. And we were concerned about practice variation in our control arm. We needed to standardize care in our control arm so we could measure a result. We had 8 very respected intensivists, academic intensivists, working in the unit. It's almost an ideal mind for the expert problem. You see it automatically subcompartmentalizes around ventilator management. You can talk about end expiratory pressures. You can talk about respiratory rates, tidal volumes, oxygen concentrations. And within each of those categories, we have very strong physiologic models, some of the best science that you'll find in all of medicine. Well, we went back to look at ventilator settings. We first demonstrated very significant variation across all 8 intensivists. That was not a surprise. The surprise was that we could show significant variation in a single intensivist, literally morning to night, on the same patient. Led us back to the literature. The start of that chain was published in 1956 by a fellow named Miller. His title says it all. He was investigating how many factors the expert mind can consider when making a decision. And he talked about the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. Short answer, 5 to 9. The problem with ventilator management, there are about 40 categories of physiologic factors that you need to consider to make a choice in each of those categories. Could I just point out that 40 is more than 9? In fact, if we just assumed that every time the physician was seeing the patient, they were subconsciously and by their own evaluation at random selecting 6 or 7 or 8 factors to optimize. If we worked it backwards that way, we could completely explain their ventilator settings. Just to show you how deeply it goes, that same year I had a trial going with a fellow named Lynn Lyon, professor of epidemiology up at the University of Utah, about choice of antibiotics for children with otitis media, ear infections. A simple decision in medicine, as simple as it gets. We were able to show similar physician variation within a single physician over time for choice of antibiotics for otitis media. Oh, once again, even for something that simple, there are more than 9 factors you need to consider. You see the problem? It's all a problem around variation. Well, now I'm ready to start the other story about variation. It starts with this man. His name's Frederick W. Taylor. Many of you may have heard about him. In 1911, he published a book called Principles of Scientific Management. Within it, he laid out, well, our first major organizational level process management approach. It's called standardized mass assembly production. Now, in fairness, it wasn't his idea. 3,000 years BC, it turns out the Egyptian army had standardized bows and arrows to help them in combat. 200 years before Taylor, find evidence of, well, a cottage industry in Great Britain, straight pins for sewing. It was made with a standardized mass assembly production process. 1789, Eli Whitney, the inventor of the cotton gin, eventually, used a standardized mass assembly production process to fill a contract to the United States government for muskets. Taylor gets the credit because he popularized it broadly. So think about the setting in which he found himself. At that point in time, formal education was craft-style education. If you'd been a man, your father might have apprenticed you to be a blacksmith, and you would have learned as an apprentice by doing. Learned a craft, a cooper to make barrels, a wheelwright to make reels. Well, actually, in an agrarian society, most people learn by doing on the family farm. Most women learn by doing in a household, you see. Most of those same people were technically illiterate. Your formal education was your craft. Well, in this setting, Taylor recognized that he had a few university-trained engineers. He took those engineers and had them plan a production process in detail, standardize parts to a specification, standardize movement, you see. And then he deployed that. He argued that it would massively increase human productivity and produce a higher quality product at the same time. The first major example we have of it is the Model T Ford in 1914. Well, you know, the first automobile was built in 1865 in France. As late as the 1880s, you could buy an automobile in the United States. You'd approach a skilled craftsman. There was a Frenchman named Chevrolet, for example, in this country. There was a German fellow named Daimler who named his favorite model after his Dodge Mercedes. But you would have gone to a skilled craftsman who knew the craft of building an automobile. They would have started with raw materials largely and created your car from scratch. They would have taken a pile of hardwood, some sheet metal, some horsehair, some leather, some glass. They would have shaped some of that hardwood into a frame, bolted it together into a frame for your car. They would have shaped other pieces into spokes for handmade wheels, fit to handmade rubber tires. They would have pounded out sheet metal into a running board, doors, a hood, a trunk, lined the glass with metal to make a windshield and windows. And when they were done, you would have had a car that was unique in all the world. No two were quite the same. They followed a general template, but no two quite the same. You see, that's craft style production. Of course, none of us would have had one of those cars. It's far too expensive. Far too expensive in terms of human resource necessary to produce a product. Most people don't understand that the way that Henry Ford actually started the first large mass assembly production line, he hired Fred Taylor. Taylor's the guy who actually built it. He had engineers then that planned a particular process, and the workers became, in a very real sense, cogs in a machine within Ford's production line. The next thing that happened, you can argue that this is mostly philosophic. Ford had come from fairly plebeian beginnings. He saw himself as a champion of the common man. He had this new production process that produced a lot more value. It was mostly philosophic, if you read his writings. He thought that he should share some of that back with his workers. One of the reasons that skilled craftsmen were willing to leave the dignity of their craft and come work in these squalorous inner cities on an assembly line was because Ford paid the unheard of wage of $5 a day, which was about 4 times more than they could make practicing their craft. When he did that, he created a class of people with sufficient income to buy his product. For example, in its first year of production, the modal buyer of the new Ford car were assembly workers in Ford's old plants. They had sufficient income, those who were interested, to purchase something at that expense. I think it was $300 in its first year, shortly rose to about $600, with some improvements a little bit later. When he did that, he started a cycle. He created a class of people with sufficient income to buy, to use the new products that were being created, and it cycled up. He created the American middle class. The reason that you can have a couple of cars in your driveway, that you can send your children to college, that you can own your own home, is this guy, Fred Taylor. a profound shift. In fact, many economists compare the impact of Taylor's idea of scientific management to the Industrial Revolution, as humanity moved from animal power to mechanical power, starting with Fulton's steam engine, ended right before World War II. The difference took about 200 years for the Industrial Revolution to play out. In about 15 years, standardized mass assembly production took over the world. Any company that couldn't adopt the new method simply failed. They could not begin to compete. And he created a new era of his own, you see. I just wanted, though, to kind of track that ahead a little bit. It starts with 1911 when Fred Taylor published Principles of Scientific Management. The next major intellectual contribution in this series, really, of process management came in 1931 when a research physicist at AT&T Bell Labs, Walter Shewhart, published a book called The Economic Control of Quality of Manufactured Product. Relatively quiet and unassuming man, Deming made him famous. Deming was running a series of classes at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, statistical courses. He'd come back from spending a year with Sir Ronald Fisher, studying statistics in Great Britain. And he gave Shewhart a chance to lecture. In 1939, Deming helped Shewhart publish his lectures in the text that Dr. Godfrey mentioned, Statistical Method from Viewpoint of Quality Control. The number I heard, Bland, for World War II, Deming was contacted by a Dr. Wallace at Stanford University on how they could contribute to the war effort. They trained over 31,000 people, is the published statistic, for improving the rates of production, reducing the amount of waste in the American war effort. There are some economists who contend that this may be one of the reasons that the United States and our allies were triumphant in that conflict. We know that the big contributor is that we outproduced our enemies. And very clearly the people that Deming and his colleagues placed in the war effort were central to that whole effort. As Bland mentioned, though, at the end of World War II, Deming was consulting with the census. He had traveled twice to Greece at the behest of the United States government to help with a pending census. He was in India, meeting with an Indian statistician when he was asked by the U.S. Department of War to travel to Japan to help plan the Japanese census. It clicked. He came back for at least 3 trips between 1947, his first trip, and 1951, when he spent 9 months in Japan lecturing on Shewhart's methods of statistical process control for managing Taylor-style production processes. You see, Shewhart had had a real insight. It was all around variation. He had understood that variation came in 2 classes. If you assume that all manufacturing and production happens through processes, Deming's main idea, all processes produce 3 classes of outcomes, what Deming called a physical outcome, in parallel, a cost outcome, and a service outcome. So what we actually control are the processes. And you always get these 3 as a set, you see. He then demonstrated that all processes had 2 kinds of variation. Some is built in. It has to do with the fact that a process is made up of thousands or millions of small causes. When you measure across a process, you're nearly always summing across thousands or millions of small processes, small causes underneath. That shows up as variation that can be described by probability theory. He called it common cause. Today we very often call it random cause or random variation within a process, but it's innate, it's built in, it's part of the process. He stood that in contrast to variation arising from identifiable external factors. He called those special causes. His point, those 2 types of variation require very different management techniques to address them, and more particularly, management controls common causes, not frontline workers. Of course, the piece that really hit me, I listened to Dr. Deming back in 1987, attended his 4-day course, and he had just a crazy idea. It's hard to describe how counterintuitive this was to a trained academic physician at the time. You have to understand, quality meant spare no expense. Quality meant if it might work, let's do it. Quality meant pull out all the stops. Quality meant you can't put a cost on a human life. I was specifically castigated for even mentioning resource utilization in a clinical setting. It was unethical, you see. Deming made this crazy argument that nearly always higher quality should mean lower cost. And that was a radically new idea for a physician trained in the traditions of Sir William Osler. I came home, we had a trial running at LDS Hospital. Dr. John Burke led it. It had to do with the second most common cause of patient injury in a hospital. It's postoperative wound infection. It's a killer. We were looking at prophylactic antibiotics to control that condition. The idea that you give antibiotics in conjunction with surgery so that if bacteria do enter the surgical incision, the first thing it encounters the antibiotic, which forthwith kills them, which means no infection. Dr. Burke and his team had developed evidence that showed there's an ideal time at which to start the antibiotics. Short version, it's a bathtub function that comes down and then swings back up. One end is marked by surgical incision time. That's the moment of maximal risk. And looking at that function, they said, if you start prophylaxis within 2 hours before a surgical incision, that's where you'll get best benefit from using the prophylaxis. We went from 40% on-time prophylaxis to 96% on-time prophylaxis with a series of process interventions. That was associated with our deep wound infection rate falling from 1.8% to 0.4%. Oh, the national standard at the time, a good hospital had a rate between 2 and 4%. We were better than the best national standard when we started. And by the time we ended with a little process management Deming style, we were 5 times better than the best national standard. Well, I approached John at the start of this trial and said, you know, John, I've just met this guy named Deming. He has a crazy idea. He says we should treat cost as just one more outcome of a process. And that was an interesting idea because even then, the administrative side of the line was under intense cost pressure. And I was living with some of those folks, working with them. I said, John, what if we just threw in another metric? What if we just tossed in cost as a metric? We were trained health services researcher. We knew how to measure. We knew how to evaluate. John said, you know, that would be really interesting. Where will we get the cost data? Well, it turns out at Intermountain we had a fellow named Steve Busboom, the vice president for finance, who had created one of the world's first activity-based costing systems. He could measure cost. We threw in those metrics and we showed that as our infection rate dropped, operating costs at the hospital fell by almost $1 million. We didn't have to pay to treat the cost of the infection. And it was a revelation. Deming was right. We then went on to show it in a whole range of different functions. Deming's theory described it in detail, 3 specific mechanisms by which your quality outcomes, your physical outcomes, drive your cost outcomes. For 2 of the 3, as you improve patient outcomes, your cost of operations should drop profoundly. You see, admittedly in the 3rd category, higher quality costs more. But the first 2 were huge, huge opportunities. You see? Well, it went one step further. The next chain in contribution. In 1951, of course, Deming published his lecture notes. Specifically, JUSC, the Japanese Union of Scientists and Engineers, published his lecture notes from his Japanese tour, Elementary Principles of the Statistical Control of Quality. In 1990, though, a fellow named Jim Womack published a book called The Machine That Changed the World. It was our first book on a particular application of Deming's theory called lean. Now, it turns out that lean has 3 main elements, one called flow, one called 100% participation. We focused on one called mass customization. It's a brand new idea that lean brought into play. So imagine I do this. I have a standardized process, but that I have smart cogs in the machine. Rather than just mandating what the workers do, I have intelligent workers who can adjust to individual customer needs. You see, we used that idea to address that big randomized controlled trial on acute respiratory distress syndrome, the variation within our intensivists and how they set a ventilator. We call them shared baselines today. Their first application was in 1991 in the context of that trial at LDS Hospital. But here's the idea. Imagine that I pick a high priority clinical process. It could be any of a number of things. Acute respiratory distress syndrome, of course. It could be pregnancy, labor, and delivery. That's the single biggest process we operate in Intermountain or any community-based health system. It could be management of ischemic heart disease, management of diabetes mellitus. You get the picture. Well, I pick one. I pull together a true team. All of the physicians are the representatives, all of the nurses, the pharmacists, therapists, technicians, the social workers, even the administrators of the team that delivers the care. We sit down and hammer out an evidence-based best practice protocol. Now, I've already hinted at it. We'll be able to find hard evidence for a small fraction of what we really need. Most of it will be based upon consensus to some level. It goes a step worse than that. Given enough time, I can demonstrate that you can't write a protocol that perfectly fits any patient, except for very few narrow areas. Think of it this way. You can see it just looking around this room. We're all different. The reason is we're genetically different. As a surgeon, I know that if I were in your abdominal cavity, that you'd have small differences in your anatomy. Sometimes large, actually. It's just part of what you expect. It goes a level deeper than that, though. You have different circulating enzymes. You have different exposure to pathogens in the environment. Because of those different circulating enzymes, you have different response to the pathogens. You have different expression of disease. You'll have different response to treatment. Layer on top of that differences in personal resources, preferences, values. It's an easy case to make. Therefore, when you deploy a shared baseline, here's the way I say it to my colleagues. I say, ladies and gentlemen, it's not just that we allow or even that we encourage, we demand that you adjust our shared baseline protocol to individual patient needs. It's technically a form of lean, of mass customization. We have about 60 of them running under measurement. From those 60, I can tell you that you'll end up changing about 5 to 15% of a typical shared baseline to meet the needs of an individual patient. It's essentially never zero. It means you're taking your most important resource, the trained expert mind, that physician, that nurse, and focusing them on the relatively narrow band of clinical care where they make a real difference, the fun part of medicine, quite honestly. You see that idea? In a very real sense, it's the opposite of cookbook medicine. Oh, we track the variances and feed the data back in a learning system with full statistical support. And through that, over time, we've been able to show massive improvements in care. This is just one. The biggest single process we operate in Intermountain is pregnancy, labor, and delivery. We deliver about 34,000 babies per year. A major sub-issue with that, it turns out that I can chemically induce labor with a drug called oxytocin. It's a common practice. It's called elective induction, where you start labor based upon the needs of the woman or her doctor without a clear medical indication for convenience, you see. Well, one of the big sub-factors with it is gestational age. Full-term delivery is 40 weeks, but very often physicians induce labor well before then. It's very uncomfortable to the mom to be pregnant at the end of pregnancy. Well, this graph shows the association between gestational age and whether that newborn will end up in the newborn ICU. Turns out there's a real risk to the newborn. If you come back to 37 weeks, which was not at all uncommon, you roughly triple newborn ICU admission rates. You see that idea? Well, we deployed a simple shared baseline into workflows at the front line. Old model, woman who talked to her obstetricians, decided that it was time to get this baby delivered. The obstetrician would say, well, just show up at the hospital next Tuesday. It's a good day for me. My schedule's clear. The nurses will check you in. They'll start an IV. They'll start the oxytocin. They'll call me when action starts to happen. We'll get that baby delivered. The only difference is that we put in a check step with the nurses that they ran the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology criteria for an appropriate elective induction. Number one on the list, gestational age. When we did that, the proportion of inappropriate elective inductions fell precipitously from 28% of all deliveries. Today it runs about 3%. Oh, I never think it'll get to be zero. If you look at the 3%, they're weird. They're strange cases with special factors that would never make their way into the protocol. Still entirely appropriate. It's the limitations of the protocol, you see. The following year, we added something called a Bishop score. It physically measures whether the woman's body is ready to deliver, a 4-part physical exam. Bishop score of 10 or higher to induce labor. The yellow bars are first deliveries, what we call primiparous deliveries. That's the hard one. The blue bars are second, third, fourth, multiparous deliveries. Well, yeah, at a Bishop score of 10, 5.8% of those mothers will go to an unplanned cesarean section. And you've just committed her to C-sections for the rest of her reproductive history, by the way. It's not good to labor against a C-section scar for someone who's not had a baby before. Yeah, if you just come back to a Bishop score of 7, it's going to triple that rate. It was not uncommon to see women delivered with a Bishop score of 1, 2, and 3 under that old system. If you see the idea again, the difference in multiparous women, the blue bars, is statistically significant. It's just not as profound. It also has a direct impact on how long labor lasts. At a Bishop score of 10 in a primiparous woman, about 9 hours, it's easy to increase it by 50% just by coming back. This shows proportion of women delivered with inappropriate Bishop scores. The most important line is the blue one. This is in primiparous women, showing proportion of all first deliveries that were inappropriate. Well, it had an impact. We reduced the length of labor in our system by about 45,000 minutes. That means we can deliver about 1,500 more children per year without a single additional labor and delivery nurse, without a single additional bed. It's called fixed cost leverage, just in passing. It's a major financial impact on the cost of the healthcare system. The reason that Intermountain C-section rate is about 21%, while the nation is at 34% this year, is appropriate elective induction. This is just variable cost savings over time. They're structural. You're bending the cost curve. Each year that team has created yet another new approach. More than $10 million in variable cost savings just from this single process. I have about 60 under management. It's about $150 million per year in cost structure for Intermountain from substantially better care. Just one more and then I need to quit. This was just a recent one. The main cause of death in a hospital is sepsis, overwhelming infection. We just completed yet another little process management step. We call them bundles. You shared baselines sometimes. It had to do with people who came in with infection through the emergency room. Very fast detection and response, aggressive treatment in the emergency room, transferring over into ICUs. We went from 30% bundle compliance to about 90%. That was associated with our mortality rates falling from 20% to 8%. Just in passing, nationally, most hospitals have a mortality rate of about 50%. We were good when we started. For us, that represents about another 115 lives per year. We haven't done the cost analysis. It will be similar as we get the care finally right. What we're really doing is going after that more than 50% of waste embedded in the system. The way I like to say it at home, though, we count our successes in lives. I can point to literally thousands of fewer deaths per year in the Intermountain system as we began to systematically manage care at the bedside in an organized system of care. It all started in 1987 in a conversation with W. Edwards Deming. You know, at the end of his career, Sir William Osler was speaking to a group of physicians, 16 of them, graduates of that new 2-year program. It was in Great Britain, the dedication of the Phipps Clinic. He had retired, had been knighted by the Queen for his many contributions, not just to the healing professions, but to humankind in general. This is what he said. I could imagine us saying that to the generation who comes after us. I'm sorry for you young men, and I'll add in women, of this next generation. Oh, you'll do great things. You'll have great victories. And standing on our shoulders, you'll see far. But you can never have our sensations. To have lived through a revolution, to have seen a new birth of science, evidence-based medicine, a new dispensation of health, reorganized medical schools, remodeled hospitals, a new outlook for humanity. That is not given to every generation. The healing professions are in the midst of a massive change, accurately reflected by that statement. It started when a statistician from manufacturing who understood variation gave us a consultation. I'll just close with one other way of saying the same thing. better has no limit, to quote an old Yiddish proverb. Thanks for your time and attention. Do we have time for questions, Dr. Godfrey? We're out of time.
I'm afraid we don't. Brent will stay around for those of you who want to stop and just ask him some personal questions, but I want to ask Sastry Pantula to come up for a very important closing of this session.
Yeah, thank you for a wonderful presentation. On behalf of ASA, I'm pleased to present a small token of our appreciation. Let me read what the plaque says. It says, Brent James, 2010 Deming Lecturer, American Statistical Association. Brent James, MD, Masters in Statistics, has brought an appreciation and visionary application of Deming's quality management methods, specifically as they pertain to clinical quality improvement and the related statistics to his home organization, Intermountain Healthcare, as well as to academic and healthcare organizations throughout the nation and the world. He embodies Deming's code of professional conduct in his use of existing methods to help clinicians and medical researchers to improve their research and to improve efficiency, uniformity, and quality of service in the healthcare industry. Thank you again. Hope to see you all at 8 p.m. Have a nice dinner.